till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. On we'll go. On we'll go. Finding life along the way, melodies we haven't played. No, I don't want no rest. Echoing around these walls, fighting to create a song. I don't wanna miss a beat. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. On we'll go. Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust.
Okay, shall we get started? Yes. We're reading this one, 48 Liberal Lies About American History You Probably Learned in School. We are quite a ways into the book. We're at lie 35, so and if my computer doesn't crash, we'll go through 35 through 38 tonight. Let's see, are these good enough for tonight? All right, just kick back and jump right into it. So we're on, like I said, we're on lie 35, which is the robber barons pillaged the land and destroyed the environment. This one starts off with only one quote, unlike most of the others. The new corporate mining had disturbing effects. Its impact on the environment was horrendous. Actually, before we get too far into that, bear with me a minute. I want to pull up my core temp thing here. Come on. Come on. There we go. Trying to keep track of that. All right. Contrary to the portrayals of lumberman Frederick Weyerhaeuser, See, for example, a National Park Service website. As one who stripped the land, the German immigrant was one of America's greatest environmentalists. By 1885, his firm was processing more than 500 million board feet of lumber from his more than 300,000 acres. He had 900,000 acres by 1900. That is the key. They were his acres. He bought them, and once the trees were gone, Weyerhaeuser was out of a gig. Like railroader James J. Hill, who built the Great Northern Transcontinental Railroad without government aid, Weyerhaeuser recognized that he must conserve and efficiently use his land, not waste it. After learning from inspectors that his lands were not as rich in timber as he thought, Weyerhaeuser devoted considerable sources to reforestation, soil erosion, and fire prevention. Nature, always held up by environmental radicals as sacred, destroyed American forests through fires. Humans, of course, generally fought forest fires, especially when settlements or crops were nearby. Fire historian and MacArthur Prize winner Stephen Pine has conducted a detailed investigation of forestry records for the period of 1940 to 1965 and found that in those 25 years, lightning started more than 228,000 fires in the United States, consuming more than 1 million acres. But put another way, nature destroyed more fire acreage in 25 years than Weyerhaeuser replenished many times over, ending up with far more trees than when he began. Other paper companies followed suit. International Paper established its own nurseries, and by the 1990s was turning out 190 million seedlings a year. By the 1920s alone, International Paper produced 4 million cords of wood a year, more than it consumed. And 80 years later, the company was planting 48 million trees per year, some 5 times more than it harvested. Like all paper companies, International Paper and Kimberly-Clark employed armies of professional foresters. It wasn't just robber barons, such as, quote-unquote, such as Weyerhaeuser. We learn in Nation of Nations that, quote, Western farmers altered the landscape by reducing the annual fires often set by Indians that had kept the prairie free from trees, end quote. So when the Indians annihilated entire forests, it was acceptable, while the whites introduced, quote, an artificial ecosystem of animals, woodlots, and crops, end quote. Those evil farmers. Shame on them for feeding all those people. Kind of what we're hearing now, huh? In his rant against American progress, James Loewen, author of Lies My Teacher Told Me, warns, quote, today American farming relies on enormous amounts of oil, not only for tractors and trucks and air conditioning, but also for fertilizers and herbicides, end quote. One might not know that we use enormous amounts of oil instead of enormous amounts of coal or wood or even whale oil. Previous power sources that have been conserved through more efficient and cleaner forms of energy. Indeed, except for the environmental movement and the antis, the even cleaner, what? I don't know what that's supposed to say. Antis, A-N-T-I-S. I don't know what that is, and it's in quotes. The even much cleaner nuclear power might well have replaced some of the oil-based... Oh, the antis. I bet you that's what that's supposed to be. Replaced some of the oil-based industry. Let me read that again. Indeed, except for the environmental movement and the antis, the even much cleaner nuclear power might well have replaced some of the oil-based industry. By the time John D. Rockefeller was finished driving kerosene prices down almost 100-fold, whale oil was so expensive that the industry had nearly vanished. After kerosene refining was, well, refined, the total value of whale products in the United States fell from $8 million in in 1864 to $3 million in 1876. The price of sperm oil was $1.50 per gallon in 1876, compared to an average gallon of kerosene at under 50 cents and falling. Crude oil prices, driven by Rockefeller's obsession with efficiency, plunged to $1 a barrel by 1890. But those were averages, and the lowest month price was an astounding 60 cents per barrel in 1890. As the real price of a barrel of kerosene dropped to 8 cents, kerosene became 6 times cheaper than whale oil by the 1890s. Many of these price cuts were engineered by Rockefeller. He saved more than $1.50 per barrel in barrels alone by manufacturing his own kilns and acquiring his own wagons to haul the kerosene. Within just 2 years of Rocky, in quotes, entering the business, prices fell by 50%. Quote, "We must remember," he told a partner, "we are refining oil for the poor man, and he must have it cheap and good," end quote. On the subject of oil, it's ironic that no one single-handedly did more to preserve a species than John D. Rockefeller, the so-called robber baron who dominated kerosene refining. Rockefeller is lambasted in textbooks. John Garrity's American Nation used dark tones to describe Rockefeller's business efficiency. Quote, "Rockefeller exploited every possible technical advance and employed fair means and foul to persuade competitors to sell out or join forces." End quote. Typically, this kind of, I don't know whether I'm actually in an ad or not. It says I'm in an ad for 45 seconds. So I will wait until it says I'm done. It's hard to tell. I've been told by viewers that it's not actually showing an ad when it says it's showing, when it tells me it's showing an ad. I'm a chill duty and you like my style. Well, thank you, Nambro. I'm just enjoying a book, so I don't know how else to enjoy it but in a chill way. Okay. All right. Moving on here. To sell out or join forces. Okay. Typically, this kind of nonsense ends with the predictable claim that, quote, "the average U.S. citizen consumes the same resources as 10 average world citizens or 25 residents of India," end quote. Another quote, "Economically," wrote James Lowen, "we are the bane, not the hope of the world, and we can only hope other nations will never achieve our standard of living, for if they did, the earth would become a desert," end quote. This nonsense comes from the book Lies My Teacher Told Me, though considering its utter lack of understanding of real economies, it should be named Lies I Concocted to Make Money. The fact is, Americans produce vastly more than, quote, 10 average world citizens, end quote, and probably outproduce some 50 residents of India or 500 residents of Chad. They benefit from our economic progress, and their only hope is to be more like us in their economic systems. Poorer nations do not need more foreign aid. They need us to export more capitalism to them. In what is called Gilder's Law, named after futurist George Gilder, a society consumes cheap resources to preserve dear resources. When whales and their oil were cheaper than other forms of energy, people consumed whales. Once kerosene became cheaper, people switched to kerosene, then to electricity. Currently, despite what the environmentalists and the media claim, the most valuable resource is still people, who must operate within the confines of time. People are more valuable than oil, coal, or copper. So naturally, our society, and all those who aspire to improve their lot in life, consumes cheaper resources, which have, by the way, never run out. We still have whales. We can still make kerosene. To conserve more valuable resources, namely human activity. Until time travel is perfected and time itself can become a commodity, it remains second only to human intellect and inventiveness as the ultimate resource. Oh, and that is actually the end of that first lies about American history, apparently. So moving on to right into 36, unless somebody's got something to say about that one. Lie 36 is federal regulators have protected the public's health by identifying harmful products. Well, we know that one's a lie. Truly and absolutely, that's a lie. And he was writing this back in, 2006. He had never heard of the COVID pandemic. Okay, so we've got two quotes to start off with. The unregulated sale of drugs posed a dangerous threat to public health. That's by David E. Harrell et al. Unto a Good Land. And the second one is, these years saw the first sustained campaign against drug abuse. Many easily obtained medicines contained opium and its derivatives, morphine and heroin. Coca-Cola contained cocaine until about 1900. And that's by Paul S. Boyer et al., The Enduring Vision. So just to get an idea of how long this one's, it's about 4 pages. Okay, here we go. Consumer advocates have often claimed that if not for the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, established 1906, unsafe and harmful products would be, quote unquote, kept on the shelves. On the other hand, it is claimed testing by the FDA ensures that those products do come into the marketplace are safe. Perhaps someone should tell that to pet owners who in 2007 saw, I guess it's a little bit later than 2000. I thought it was 06. Maybe it's 07 or 09. 08. It came out in 2008. Okay. That now we all know. Perhaps someone should tell that to pet owners who in 2007 saw Chinese products infiltrate most brands of pet food, killing hundreds of cats and dogs, or the toothpaste makers who likewise suffered from an ingredient invasion in 2007. There was a product that was showing up in dog and cat food. It also showed up in baby formula coming out of China. What was that? I'm blanking on the name of it right now. But yeah, it was a big mess for a while. I didn't realize it was so far back. The dog and cat thing was in 07, but I think the baby formula one was around 2012-ish. Maybe a little bit later than that even. 100 years after it had been established, the FDA was blocking unapproved drugs from patient access, including terminally ill patients who lacked any other hope. Thankfully, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, in the Abigail Alliance versus von Eschenbach case, ruled that the U.S. Constitution indeed did protect the rights of terminally ill patients to use treatments not approved by the FDA. Historically, how has the FDA done? It may come as a shock that the first big test case for the FDA was not a product such as heroin, cocaine, or even tobacco, but that vile, dangerous liquid known as Coca-Cola. The so-called father of the Pure Food and Drug Act, Dr. Harvey Wiley, a prominent reformer and, of course, a leading progressive, had established himself as a godlike source of nutritional information for the public. He had worked in the U.S. Department of Agriculture and in 1902 was awarded $5,000 by Congress to study the effect of various food preservatives on 12 human subjects. The subjects were volunteers who worked in Wiley's office. I'm sure they volunteered. They voluntarily did the study so they didn't lose their jobs. These poison squad, quote-unquote, members were fed meals laced with borax, sulfuric acid, sodium benzoate, and formaldehyde. This information is touted on none other than the FDA's own website. I'm just being picky here, but does it not seem strange that the same agency that refuses to allow dying patients to experiment with unapproved drugs subjected people to poison tests? Reporters of the day apparently thought so, interviewing the chef through a basement window. Even Wiley's willingness to join the 12 volunteers and eat the meals himself did not reassure the public, which ridiculed the tests in minstrel shows. Eventually, Wiley stopped the experiments, but only after many of his subjects became so ill with vomiting and stomach problems they could not work any longer. Not surprisingly, however, the FDA viewed this as a success for helping Wiley, quote, gain a congressional hearing, as well as gain support for his contention that chemical preservatives had no place in food, end quote. The FDA also proudly claims that, quote, although no formal long-term follow-up was done on members of the poison squad, anecdotal reports indicate that none were harmed, end quote. Certainly that's a criterion that corporate America wishes it were held to. I don't think they do. They don't. Wiley's objectivity, however, was in question from the start. He, quote, repeatedly made statements favoring some companies' products over others, end quote, determining, for example, that glucose was bad but sucrose was acceptable. He also supported straight whiskey, which used a distillation of mash and fermented grain, at least 4 years old, over rectified whiskey, a simple mix of alcohol and water, which called into question the whole notion of the public good, as according to 2 recent scholars of the whiskey industry, his efforts were, quote, if anything, harmful to the consumer because he endorsed the more poisonous product, end quote. Wiley's campaign against Coca-Cola marked the final phase of a long battle the company had fought with the government over the quote-unquote secret ingredient, which officials claimed was cocaine. Even before the government trial started, pharmaceutical tests showed that the amount of cocaine in a drink per serving was 1/30th of a grain. One historian of Coca-Cola argued that Dr. Asa Candler's process had so diluted the cocaine that, quote, it seemed unlikely that cocaine, or anything else for that matter, could survive, end quote. By the time Wiley got the company into the courts, there was no viable evidence that there was any cocaine in the product, so he switched tactics and, quote, initiated a series of changes over the process the company used to dilute the cocaine out, emphasis in original, end quote. Out is in italics. Finally, the obvious silliness of the government's case forced Wiley to shift his ground yet again, now arguing that the product was misbranded because it did not contain cocaine. So he was just after him. The 1911 trial in Chattanooga bordered on the surreal. As one historian noted, the government paraded witnesses before the court, quote, whose testimony was designed to horrify the jury and alarm the public, end quote. Prosecutors called a laborer to the stand who admitted that, quote, doing hard physical labor next to a steaming hot kettle in a factory in the deep south in the middle of July, he was sweating, emphasis in original, sweating is in italics, end quote. When Wiley's attorneys could not produce a single Coca-Cola fiend, quote unquote, the government's case collapsed. This has not stopped modern progressives such as Michael Jacobson of the Anti-Capitalist Center for Science in the Public Interest from attempting to bring lawsuits against McDonald's for making teenagers obese, or banning buttered popcorn from movie theaters, or most recently targeting ice cream. Allying with the FDA, such quote-unquote consumer groups have in fact made litigation a permanent tactic of the nation's health police. Buoyed by their decades-long war against big tobacco, these advocates have found that often merely bringing a charge against a product, medicine, or company is enough to force its removal from the marketplace without any scientific proof of harm whatsoever. And that's exactly the tactic the snowflakes are using, and they did use, to get rid of things like not the products themselves, but the icons, the mascots, if you will. You know, Uncle Ben's rice, Aunt Jemima. They got rid of the Land O'Lakes Indian. They got rid of all of that just by saying it was racist, and instead of fighting against that, they just caved and got rid of the stuff. Of course, now people joke. They successfully got rid of every person of color, I hate that term, but on packaging, and it's only just white people on packaging now. So they really succeeded. Whiskey is risky, but never fear with a few beers. My kid wandered in and asked, "Is this man reading bedtime stories?" Aunt Jemima, rest in peace for Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben. Yeah, for sure. But there's good news, though. The Washington, I think it's the Washington Redskins, the Indians came out and said, "Hey, put the chief back on there. That's a real guy, and that was in honor of us." So I'm hoping something comes of that. Okay, nothing illustrates this perverted process more than the Alar scare of the Alar, A-L-A-R. It's capitalized. I don't know what that word is. Scare of the 1980s. Although the public concerns about Alar, a pesticide that contained a possible carcinogen for humans called UDMH, were heightened by the CBS TV news show 60 Minutes in February 1989. The so-called science behind it was based on a single nutritionist's tests. Congress called witnesses, including the famous scientist Meryl Streep. I love this guy's humor sometimes. Congress called witnesses, including the famous scientist Meryl Streep, whose testimony was widely covered. Peer-reviewed studies showed a correlation between UDMH and lab animal tumors, but later it was revealed that the lab animals were given levels of UDMH equal to a boxcar load of apples per day. One study found that the average daily dose of UDMH, and we all eat apples daily, right, was 1/10 that found in tap water, and a tiny fraction found in a normal serving of peanut butter. College students were dismayed to find that an average serving of beer contained almost 10,000 times as much UDMH as Alar-coated apples. That reminds me of the studies they did on saccharin back in the day. They were basically they were trying to show that it was cancer causing, and they were able to induce cancer in the mice that they were testing it on, but they had to give them, almost the same thing, practically a boxcar load of saccharin every day to get them to end up with cancer. It was kind of one of these things. Okay, not that I particularly care for any artificial sweetener, but that one just sticks out in my mind. Dr. Richard Adamson, then director of the National Cancer Institute's Division of Cancer Etiology, said, quote, "The risk of eating an apple treated with alar is less than the risk of eating a peanut butter sandwich or a well-done hamburger," end quote. And he has more recently described the cancer risk from eating alar-treated apples as, quote-unquote, non-existent. The director of the FDA's own toxicological sciences division called the alar scare total baloney. Meanwhile, having voluntarily withdrawn alar in anticipation of public action, apple growers lost millions of dollars. Public interest groups repeatedly see sinister connections between corporations and scientists or regulators in the approval process. If you work for a company as a lobbyist or lawyer, it seems you aren't just employed, you are a prostitute. Rarely, however, do we get a glimpse of the other side of the coin. In a fight over the sweetener aspartame, a nutritionist who launched some of the earliest charges against it invested money in G.D. Searle, aspartame's manufacturer, with put options designed to take advantage of falling stock prices. Woodrow Monty, quote, "didn't think there was anything wrong," end quote, with producing research that would inevitably cause a company's stock to decline and making money off of it. So far, most companies have either fought such actions by regulators and consumer groups in the courts or meekly submitted. Yet how many products have come under fire, only to later be shown to be free of their alleged evils? In my lifetime alone, coffee, bacon, and diet soda have all been labeled dangerous or carcinogenic. Yet over time, scientists have also discovered correlations, not causes, with health improvements for most of them. Even tobacco has been shown to have positive correlations for some diseases. Nicotine, according to a British study, quote, "can slow down the onset of Parkinson's symptoms and help with, quote unquote, and treat schizophrenia and Alzheimer's." According to the 1998 report for the London Electronic Telegraph, the World Health Organization even buried a study that showed no link between secondhand smoking and lung cancer and found it might even have a protective effect. What do we got here? Nice thick bacon sandwich and a cup of black coffee? Hell yeah. One of my favorite things is a BLT with lots of B. A second study in the British Medical Journal found no increase in the risk of heart disease or lung cancer from passive smoke. More amazing still, Vacaville, California, biotechnology company found positive results in fighting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from an experimental cancer drug manufactured in tobacco plants. The issue is not whether smoking is harmful. Most studies still agree it is, but how many other products are and will be banned or driven out of the marketplace because zealots leveraged media coverage in such a way as to produce unscientifically grounded hysteria. Within the government fought Coca-Cola, Coke won. Or when the government. Next time we may not be so lucky. Our ho-hos are at stake. Our ho-hos. Okay. Some of these are just goofy. They're supposed to be lies you learned about America, but like that one, whatever. Anyway, so Moving on to lie number 37. We've got global warming as a fact, and it's a man-made, American-driven problem. This one, I don't know how much I'll agree with him, but as far as the title goes, 100%. CO2 is plant food. And anybody that tells you otherwise is a fucking idiot. Okay, global warming is a fact, and it's man-made, American-driven problem. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 quotes to start this one off. The balance of nature is delicate. Humans have upset the balance, stripping the land of its green cover, choking the air, poisoning the seas. That's by Michael Scott, the Young Oxford Book of Ecology. The second one is, starting in 1970, there was a precipitous drop-off in the amount and extent and thickness of the Arctic ice cap. That's by Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth. And we all know how brilliant and what a fantastic Nobel Prize-winning scientist Al Gore is. We know where most heat-trapping gases come from, power plants and vehicles, and we know how to limit their emissions. That is by Natural Resources Defense Council 2003. And then the fourth one is, the threat of global warming seemed especially urgent, heightening global warming fears. The 10 hottest years of the 20th century all occurred after 1985. And that is by Paul S. Boyer et al., The Enduring Vision. So this one is, they're all about the same length tonight, so that's good. When former Vice President Albert Gore beat out many serious luminaries to win the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for environmental activism, highlighted by his movie An Inconvenient Truth, the notion of man-made global warming reached a new pinnacle in the annals of non-scientists hijacking scientific research. Gore did not get away with his distortions entirely. However, in London, the High Court judge signaled that public schools were required to issue a warning before showing Gore's film because it was, quote-unquote, politically biased and contained serious, quote-unquote, scientific inaccuracies and sentimental mush. Hear, hear. When news of this reached CNN, meteorologist Rob Marciano clapped his hands and exclaimed, finally, quote, finally, there are definitely some inaccuracies in the film, he said. The biggest thing I have a problem with is this implication that Katrina was caused by global warming, end quote. Even Al Gore's home state of Tennessee is half a degree cooler than when he was a kid. Physicists Henrik Svensmark and Egil Friis Christensen of the Danish National Space Center released a study on climate change that claimed the, quote, sun still appears to be the main forcing agent in global climate change, end quote. Environmental scientist Fred Singer charges that the misplaced resources going to fight a natural change that is beyond human control, quote, will severely damage national economies, decrease standards of living, and increase poverty. This misdirection will adversely affect human health and welfare in industrialized nations and even more in developing nations, end quote. And he is right, and it's happening. S. Drobot, J. Maslanik et al. Have theorized that, quote-unquote, Arctic oscillation was the most dominant factor affecting Arctic climate, but they found that even after the Arctic Oscillation Index was neutral, other changes associated with Arctic oscillation still occurred, leaving them to conclude that a tipping point in warming had already been reached and was receding. Sami Solanki of the Max Planck Institute for Solar System solar system research began to chip away at the man-caused global warming myth in 2004 when his studies confirmed that, quote, the sun has been at its strongest over the past 60 years and may now be affecting global temperatures, end quote. Climatologist Bill Burrows of the Royal Meteorological Society agreed, saying, quote, perhaps we are devoting too many resources to correcting human effects on the climate without being sure that we are the major contributor, end quote. Solanki's team studied sunspot data going back hundreds of years and concluded that they were correlated with a warming Earth. Every time someone produced quote-unquote evidence of human-caused global warming, the facts interfered. Yes, Mount Kilimanjaro's snows have retreated, but the retreat started in the 19th century, before there were human greenhouse gases. As for Al Gore's dire warning about seaside cities being swallowed up by the oceans caused by melting ice, it would take 1,000 years for the oceans to rise 2 inches, and 20,000 years for them to rise a yard. The notion of scientific consensus, quote-unquote, on global warming is a political phrase drummed up by hysteria mongers such as Al Gore. There, quote, is no such consensus, end quote, notes Singer. Researcher Benny Pizer examined 1,117 peer-reviewed publications, the contents of which showed that nearly 3 times as many studies rejected or doubted the notion that humans caused global warming as those that did see humans as the main cause, and 2/3 of studies made no reference to human influence on climate. Even when studies could produce a slight majority saying that human causes were mostly responsible for climate change, 10% of the scientists strongly disagreed with the statement, more than those who strongly supported it. Evidence from balloon-borne radiosondes. I'm sorry, it's another word I'm not familiar with. It's radio, R-A-D-I-O, S-O-N-D-E-S. Radiosondes. I don't know what that is. But they're balloon-borne, whatever they are. Shows a slight decrease in warming over the equator, nullifying one of the key arguments of the global warming crowd. The federal government's own predictions failed to match reality, as noted in its Climate Change Science Program report of 2006. As Singer points out, no one has a good model for calculating the impact of water vapor, and it's just as likely that water vapor produces the impact of CO2. Moreover, the oft-cited hockey stick plot showing a skyrocketing trend in warming was shown to have been based on fundamental mathematical flaws. Al Gore cited the breakup of the Larsen ice shelf in the Antarctic, but most of Antarctica has been getting colder. And where global warming demagogues worry about the extinction of polar bears since the 1970s, all while the world was theoretically warming, polar bear numbers increased from around 5,000 to as many as 25,000 in 2007. Dozens of other scientists, so it got warmer and they made more babies. That's what that tells me. Dozens of other scientists have challenged the man-made global warming mantra. The part of the Arctic where rising temperatures is supposedly endangering polar bears has shown fluctuations since 1940, but no overall temperature rise. Richard Morgan of the World Meteorological Organization noted of the Canadian Arctic that from 1971 to 1981, the ice thickness changed from average to above average, followed by a sharp decrease over 2 years, followed by another recovery, and so on, to a steady increase to normal conditions since 2001. More astounding is the scientists' observation that the dramatic scenes of ice breaking off and collapsing into the sea is an indicator of the normal advance of a glacier, that is, of increasing ice levels. Morgan pointed out that massive areas of cooling are found all the way from the coasts of South America and the Amazon Valley to the Black Sea and Caucasus. Danish and Swiss researchers discovered from samplings taken in Greenland's ice core that a consistent, repeated cycle of warming and cooling occurs every 2,550 years. 2,550 years. Not only have the hysterics on the left misjudged man's role in global warming, they have also ignored the widespread positive effects such as a warming trend could have. For example, vast expanses of the earth will, for the first time in centuries, be available for cultivation. Robert O. Mendelsohn of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies suggests the gains in agriculture in particular will be greater than the losses. Yet only 30 years ago, Newsweek ran an article citing scientific research claiming the world was entering a period of global cooling. When the Copenhagen Consensus, a center for analyzing solutions to the world's biggest challenges, ranked 17 ways to use its funds, it ranked the Kyoto Protocol, designed to control global warming, 16th, saying that its costs outweighed its benefits. Fred Singer and Dennis Avery point out in Unstoppable Global Warming, Every 1,500 Years, that the Scaremeisters are hysterical when glaciers retreat, but also when they advance. The tactics of the global warming fearmongers led Bjorn Lomborg to publish a book in 2001 called The Skeptical Environmentalist. Lomborg challenged all the existing environmentalist boogeymen, including global warming. He concludes that, quote, our environmental problems are often getting smaller and not bigger, end quote. Unfortunately for Al Gore, almost as many scientific studies have shown no global warming, or certainly no human-caused global warming, as have claimed such a warming exists. Consider a Swedish study of air temperatures reconstructed from freshwater pearl mussels, which concluded that, quote, both series do not reveal any significant long-term temperature trends, end quote. Or consider the recent comments of nationally known hurricane forecaster William Gray, who says NASA's global warming guru James Hansen is 180 degrees off. Quote, in 10 years, I expect the globe to be somewhat cooler than it is now, end quote. Storms are not getting more severe, and certainly global warming did not cause Hurricane Katrina. It is especially important to note that far more powerful hurricanes occurred in the era before the Industrial Age. A common tactic of the environmentalists is to posit threats to the environment without examining what benefits environmental changes bring. Warming climate, more food, fewer hungry people, and less energy consumption to stay warm. More rain, fewer deserts, and again, more food. The notion that, as Al Gore suggested, the oceans would rise by 20 feet would require more than 1,000 years worth of heavy ice melts. More significant, the motivation behind most of these environmental scare tactics is to conceal a deeper assault on free market capitalism. If it's not warming the worker, in other words, it must be harming the planet. While some environmentalists, such as Lomborg, are sincere, many more are out-of-work Marxists who lack a cause now that the Soviet Union is defunct. A good rule of thumb is scratch an environmentalist, find an anti-capitalist. The market demands that humans allocate scarce resources, and every time solutions are offered without examining the trade-offs, it is a good bet the market isn't involved at all. Okay. Yeah, that one I agree with pretty much everything he said there. It's been fear-mongering. We know that the earth goes through cycles. And we also know that CO2 is plant food. So if you're trying to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere, you're harming plant life, which in turn harms animal life, human life. In fact, there have been recent things that have come out where these big environmentalists have been asked, how much CO2 is in the atmosphere? And they haven't been able to answer. They've guessed, 5%, 10%. The answer is 0.04%. And if it drops to or below 0.02%, plants die, which means we die. So trying to remove any CO2 is stupid. Not to mention, in order to make plants thrive in greenhouses, they pump CO2 in. But you can't tell that to an environmental knucklehead. They won't listen. They are bound and determined you're an evil earth killer. Okay, so we're going to do one more. Unless anybody has something to say on that, we'll do one more. And that is lie number 38. Lie number 38. The Constitution was the creation of elites protecting their financial interests. And we have two quotes this time. First one. The movement for the Constitution was originated and carried through principally by four groups of personal interests which had been adversely affected under the Articles of Confederation: money, public securities, manufacturers, and trade and shipping. That's by Charles A. Beard, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. The second one is, in fact, the Founding Fathers did not want a balance except one which kept things as they were, a balance among the dominant forces at that time. And that is by Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. Alrighty, here we go. Charles Beard's famous book, Applying Economic Determinism to the Revolutionary Ideas of the U.S. Constitution, is something of a dead issue today among most historians, even those on the left. Unfortunately, the filter-down process of instruction from professors to high school teachers lingers many years after the concepts are outdated. In fairness, Beard himself admitted, quote, "If anywhere I have said or written that all history can be explained in economic terms, I was then suffering from an aberration of the mind," end quote. Rejecting the notion that his interpretation sprang from Marxian theories, Beard nevertheless claimed rightly that, quote, "whoever leaves economic pressures out of history or out of the discussion of public questions is in mortal peril of substituting mythology for reality," end quote. As a refresher, Beard examined the economic and financial interests of those members of the Constitutional Convention, finding them to be, surprise, men of substance. He also examined the ratification conventions and claimed that they were similarly the domain of small groups of propertied men. However, Zinn expressed the basic premise with more disgust, but with the same essential economic determinist verve. Quote, and this is a fairly long one, "The Constitution then illustrates the complexity of the American system, that it serves the interest of a wealthy elite, but also does enough for small property owners, for middle-income mechanics and farmers, to build a broad base of support. The slightly prosperous people who make up this base of support are buffers against the blacks, the Indians, the very poor whites. They enable the elite to keep control," end quote. Okay. The obvious small problem with such silly comments is that A, Zinn himself has become one of the wealthy elite by trashing the founders, and B, the American system, quote unquote, if it was so designed as he and Beard claimed, was an was so anemic and poorly conceived that critics such as himself obviously evaded its restrictions. And C, within 85 years of its writing, a president, using the Constitution as a guide, liberated the very blacks the document was supposed to keep in their place. As any good student of history knows, of course, Forrest MacDonald has dissected and reversed much of Beard's original study in his book, We the People. Reassessing Beard's definition of what constituted wealth and property, MacDonald found, quote, the details of Beard's argument to be incompatible with the broad outlines he sketched, end quote, and said the way in which Beard asked the questions was meaningless. The Philadelphia Convention acted neither as a concerted economic group nor as the product of some abstract causes of class struggle. Instead, MacDonald found too many of the interest groups were indifferent to the issues of the others and were never aligned toward similar strategies. More significant, the political interests of all states were represented, but not the economic interests. The Constitution, it had to be concluded, was about ideas, not money. To anyone except perhaps Zinn and Matt Damon's character in Good Will Hunting, this would be obvious, especially considering that economic historians, who would love nothing better than to prove the primacy of economics in everything, have completely rejected economic motivations as the main cause of the American Revolution. For the field of economic history, this has been a dead subject for more than 2 decades, but because of the ongoing economic determinist indoctrination of high school teachers, it is worth a revisit here. In the movie Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon, as the heroic Harvard janitor Will, overhears Ivy League students discussing Gordon Wood's work, most likely the creation of the American Republic. He pompously informs them that if they want the real history of the American Revolution and Constitution, they should read Zinn's book. If they did, they would have missed the better part of scholarship in American economic history for the last 20 years when it came to the causes of the Revolution. As early as 1942, Lawrence Harper began to question the notion that Americans revolted solely against the financial burden of British taxes. He began to look at the impact of the British imperial system on trade. In 1965, Robert Thomas applied the new econometric approach to American business life and discovered that the gross burden on Americans came to $1.24 per person in 1770, not an insignificant amount at the time when $1 could be equal to a week's wages or more. However, Thomas also saw that the British system did offer some benefits, including the protection of the Royal Navy for the American exports, some military protection on the frontier, and certain bounties on American-produced goods. These benefits equaled almost 40 cents per person, making the net loss of belonging to the British imperial system about $1 million total, or less than 1% of income. Who goes to war for 1% of his income? State and local governments today routinely increase taxes more than that with impunity. That's true, but we've all become pussies. In their survey of American economic history scholarship, Jeremy Attic and Peter Passell concluded, quote, the British presence was not a serious financial hardship to the colonists, end quote. Others, including Peter McClelland, have supported the general findings of Thomas and others that found the Navigation Acts only accounted for at most 3% of GNP, an amount that about equal to the impact of the 1970s oil crisis and substantially less than the burden of the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. Increasingly, historians have come to take the colonists at their word. The taxes themselves were far less important than the process by which they were enacted. When the Americans said no taxation without representation, They meant exactly that. They were willing to be taxed, but wanted a voice in the levying of those taxes. As Bernard Bailyn's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution made clear, there were ideas at stake. Some have attempted to rehabilitate Beard using the econometric approach. This has merely led to renewed focus on what is an interest. In fact, some of the research supposedly supporting Beard showed that slaveholders did not vote for ratification of the Constitution that would supposedly protect their interests. However, along the way, scholars began to adopt a more common sense, less Marxist view that says when people can, they will obviously seek to advance their interests. This public choice approach has viewed legislation as a marketplace in which different bidders affect the desirability, i.e. the political price, of any particular legislation. But when have people not had interests and acted on them? At issue is whether the founders placed their economic interests ahead of their fundamental beliefs. They did not. Consider George Washington. No matter how he was damaged by the Navigation Acts, it was nothing compared to the loss he would have suffered by leading this Continental Army. If captured, he was automatically a traitor and subject to be hanged. Certainly, his plantation could not increase in value during a war. In short, Washington had everything to lose and nothing financially to gain, but he did have an unshakable belief in liberty. So did the other signers of the Declaration of Independence, all of whom were guilty of treason by putting their names to the document. As Rush Limbaugh's father, Rush H. Limbaugh II, pointed out in a classic speech called Americans Who Risked Everything, almost all of the signers of the Declaration lost money and property, and many lost family, for the cause they cherished. None profited from the Revolution. People have fought over money in the past. Americans have fought over money. But look deep enough, and in most cases you'll find that the real battle is over ideas, as it was in the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And that is the end of that lie about American history that you probably learned in school. That puts us at 39. So that means, you know what? The next one is barely 3 pages, and my throat's feeling okay. That's usually what causes me to stop. I'm feeling okay tonight, though. I might just do that last one. That'll put us on 40, and we only have 8 to go, which I can do in 2 sessions. I could just leave it for next time, but let's keep on going. One more. We'll do 39. Northern capitalist greed, not slavery, drove the Civil War. We have one quote at the top. The South was fighting against the census returns that told of accumulating industrial capital, multiplying captains of industry, expanding railway systems, widening acres tilled by free farmers. And that is by Charles A. Beard and Mary R. Beard, The Rise of American Civilization. It's hard to believe that with all the available evidence, a fusion of Marxists and radical libertarians still want to discount the central place of slavery as the causative factor in the Civil War. Charles Beard, the original left-wing historian, along with his wife Mary, was the first to concoct such an explanation in his Rise of American Civilization, 1913. It constituted, according to Beard, a quote-unquote second American Revolution, in which big, bad capitalism defeated a feudal Southern economy. To someone who subscribes to Karl Marx's dialect, this was just a step toward full-blown socialism. Slavery, in fact, was such an overpowering institution in the South that it was absolutely untouchable in any way, shape, or form. As historian David Leitner contends, quote, Nowadays, most historians have faced up to the fact that the South's preoccupation with states' rights was but a thin veneer over the real issue. The only states' right that was under threat was the right to hold black people in slavery. End quote. Slaves were labor, but they were also capital, a point that has been downplayed with unfortunate results. While many historians focused solely on the South's loss of labor if emancipation should come, which was significant but not fatal, it was the slave value as capital that constituted the backbone of Southern wealth. James Houston has laid the numbers out in stark fashion. In 1859, the slaveholding states in wealth per capita ranked number 1 through 3 and number 5 through 8 out of the top 17 wealthiest states per capita. Southern states made up all but 4. New York, the wealthiest state overall, did not even make the top 17 when considered per capita. Average per capita income for Southerners was slightly above the national average of all whites in 1860. Even more astounding, the dollar value of slaves in 1860 stood at approximately $3 billion. Total U.S. national wealth was $16 billion, meaning that slaves alone contributed about 19% of the American national wealth. Historians have long debated whether economic interests sparked the American Revolution, with the presumption being that the burden of the Navigation Act and taxes was so severe that the American colonists, to paraphrase Popeye the Sailor, quote, stood all we could stands 'cause we can't stands no more, end quote. That debate vanished in the mid-20th century when a number of academics found that the total burden of the British taxes was about 1% of the American GNP. And common sense tells people that no one will fight over 1%, except perhaps a New York waiter. The historians concluded that it was the prospect of Britain's passing additional acts through what the colonists saw as an unjust process that finally ticked them off. The point is, Americans did not fight the British over 1%, but close to 20% is another matter. As Houston notes, slaveholding, quote, comprised far more national wealth than railroads and manufacturing combined. The $3 billion in slaves was almost 50% more than the $2.2 billion invested in railroads and manufacturing, end quote. Free laborers well knew they could not compete against slaves, a point made abundantly obvious by the transportation revolution that brought the two systems for the first time into direct competition in the 1850s. This competition arose first in the territories, even where slavery did not exist. For example, Charles Calomiris and I discovered that the Panic of 1857 was touched off by a political decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision. East-West Railroad bonds crashed immediately after this decision was made public, but those of North-South lines, i.e. lines that did not go to the territories, barely budged. Dred Scott threw open the possibility that slavery would be extended into all the western territories, a bleak prospect that the markets well understood. Modern labor groups decry the practice of outsourcing. Imagine if northern factories had begun outsourcing work to southern slave mills, and while the market revolution did not seem likely to change southern slavery in any way, it already had allowed slavery to affect northern market prices, again, especially in western territories where slave labor might directly compete with free labor. In the debates over the Compromise of 1850, Southerners made clear that only slavery and not the tariff or any other clash of culture was at the root of their fears of the national government. Robert Toombs of Georgia asserting, quote, I stand upon the great general principle that the South has a right to equal participation in the territories of the United States and to enter them all with her property and securely enjoy it, end quote, proved that Southerners defined their section solely by their ability to own slaves, emphasis mine. I don't know where he emphasized it. Oh, enter them all. That's what. The territories became the linchpin of the slavery debate because the South, for reasons of political power, had to increase the number of slave states, while the North would not tolerate any new slave states. This is what Houston rightly called the quote-unquote nationalization of slavery. In property rights, all states ultimately had to respect the same property rights, or the definition of property had to be fundamentally changed so as not to include people. Ultimately, if property rights in slaves were beyond the control of Congress, the people of the territories, as Dred Scott claimed, or even the states through Congress, then there was no legal or constitutional means to prohibit slavery even in the North. As if the sheer burden of the numbers on slave capital were not enough, South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun underscored the point of the necessity of slavery and even went further. Quote, "If we have a right to hold our slaves, we have a right to hold them in peace and quiet, and the toleration in non-slaveholding states of the establishment of societies and presses, and the delivery of lectures with the express intention of calling into question our right to own slaves is not only a violation of international laws, but a federal compact." End quote. Then U.S. Senator from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis, made it rather plain. Quote, "What is there in the character of that property, slaves, which excludes it from the general benefit of the principles applied to all other property?" End quote. And that's the end of that one. It's done. It's over. So that puts us at 40, like I said. So there are 8 more to go. I don't think there's any kind of an epilogue or anything. Or conclusions. I don't know. Oh, there is. Final lie. Is that... Oh, okay. Final lie is the 48th lie. And... yeah. And there's nothing beyond that. So we will do 4 more next week, and then we'll finish it up. So, I already know what book I'm going to do next. I ain't even asking. I normally do a poll, but I've already decided on the next one. So, I'm going to read The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin next. So, there we go. All right. Moving right along. Who have we got on? Anybody I want to go see? Just went to Count BB the other night. Not going back 2 nights in a row. Meh. We'll just call it there. I will see you all in the next one, which should be Red Dead Redemption tomorrow night, barring catastrophe. So I'll see you there.
Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take the picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind to get my better. I wanna push back, that's all you love me. I'm back, tryna get me free. That I attacked you. That's just false true. No need to argue. And yeah, I'm happy. You'll find it trying to find it. I find you there. There's more than baby. Trying to go alone. I find you there. You'll find me. I'm so scared, my house, I cannot from this. Always be watched by no one's so still. My privacy, static, probably haven't heard of it. To live a different life, just got me cameras on Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take a picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind to get my better side. I wanna push you back. That's all you want. Me, I'm back. Tryna get me free. And I attacked you. That's just all true. No need to argue. And yeah, I'm happy. You're fine, baby. Inside of pain. I find you there. There's more than me, baby. Inside of pain. I find you there. You're fine, baby. Inside of pain. I find you there. I'm so scared, my house, I cannot from this. Always be watched by no one's so still. My privacy, static, probably haven't heard of it. To live a different life, just got me cameras on.